in fact, it's necessary that if we're involved in faith to also be engaged in some way within civic or political life.
Right.
Hello, and welcome to Interfaith Exchange. Interfaith Exchange is an online multimedia community that works to promote discussion across faith backgrounds and to help young people understand and express what it means to have faith in the context of modern society. I'm Grace Stewart. In a minute, you'll be seeing an interview with Cody Coyne, a Unitarian minister at Cross Street Chapel in Manchester, UK, hosted by Rahim Zafar and Porter Clements. Rev Cody will be discussing how he came to ministry, how Unitarianism came to be, and the engagement between religion and politics. They'll also be diving into some theological questions about the wide range of beliefs covered by Unitarianism and how these affect Rev Cody's personal understanding of Jesus as a religious figure. We hope you're enjoying these interviews, so please give us your feedback in the comments and like, share, and subscribe for more. Be sure to check out the description for our social media accounts and website where you can find articles on a range of interfaith topics. And now, on to the interview.
All right, so thank you very much, Reverend Cody Coyne, for joining Interfaith Exchange on this interview today. Cody, you're a minister at Cross Street Chapel in Manchester, but you're originally from the United States. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about your journey and how you ended up in Manchester and your journey to becoming a minister.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. So I was born in Michigan, in the States, and when I was born, my parents were attending Unitarian Universalist church. The two faiths in the U.S. had merged in the 60s, but neither of them had grown up in that church. They'd grown up in sort of more mainstream Protestant Christian churches. An atheist or is an atheist, and my mom was more just sort of a agnostic. So they'd wanted to find a sort of spiritual home, as is very much in U.S. culture. Even if you don't necessarily, even if you're not sort of the most religious person, there's still, when you have children, there's a certain impulse, I think, have some spiritual upbringing. So they found that church primarily for my brother and sister when they were born. And then when I was born, it made sense to continue going there. So I grew up in the UU tradition in the States. And I had, when I was about 12 or 14, my piano teacher happened to be the pianist for the church. And when she wanted a Sunday off, she would ask me to take over to play the hymns and the music in the service. So that was my first experience, because of course, as a child, you tend to go off to Sunday school sort of partway through the service, the church that I went to. And so that was my first experience being in the church, sort of attending a whole church service and seeing the minister, particularly in their, so I suppose in their filled role in terms of preaching. And it was something that I just felt immediately drawn to. So from about the age of 16, I was very, I knew at some. However, all the ministers that I had seen or had known were older. They'd had careers or jobs prior to ministry. They'd either retired from those jobs early, or they had sort of had a moment of enlightenment when they had their own sort of sense of vocation or calling, and then they retrained later in life. So that for me was sort of that's the natural journey for a Unitarian minister, is you have a career, especially because the services I had attended, there were a lot of anecdotes about their life, if they were a musician, about their life on the road, or if they were in academia, it was about sort of what they'd learned in those sort of the various roles. So I had grown up with this perception that, if I have a career prior to ministry, it will fill me with these anecdotes that then will sort of feed the time in ministry. So I was a very proficient musician. I ended up doing an undergraduate in Rochester, New York, the Eastman School of Music. And I came over to do a master's at Royal Northern College of Music, all with the intention of becoming a performing musician have that life on the road, build up the anecdotes, and then later in life go into a career in ministry, or have a calling in ministry. Of course, as is often the case, life throws a curveball, and it became very clear that call to ministry was something that needed to be brought forward. I wasn't, the separation between my ambition with music and my sort of calling with ministry meant that I ended up abandoning music sort of earlier in life and then pursuing ministry training. But I was in Manchester. I had met a woman who's become my wife, Catherine, who's a musician as well. And so, it just, when it was very clear that I was going to be staying here rather than returning to the States, I began to look into training over here. The different training models are different between in the States and the UK. There's been a drive to be a minister ever since I was about 16, but it was only sort of a bit later in life that I realized that that drive was sort of it was a much stronger call than I had sort of anticipated, and that direction in life meant that I came into it a bit earlier than I had originally planned, but for which I've, of course, all the enriched for.
So just picking up on something you said when you're talking about sort of like your parents' involvement in the UU church, I really liked how you put it, that it's sort of a common feature in American spiritual life that when you have kids, it's like, oh well, guess I got to start going to church now.
Yes.
Because that's certainly what happened for me when I was growing up. So I'm wondering if you feel that, particularly in the context of Unitarianism or Unitarian Universalism, if there's some sense of the importance of community as something which kind of guides people in the direction of taking part in church and that sort of thing.
I think it is. I think it's just more so than just about anything else. It is, it is the community. We have a hymn over here that's a church is a living fellowship more than of bricks or stone, and the whole when people ask me about sort of what Unitarianism is at its root, I say that a lot of other faiths, or I don't want to discuss, put in the context of what other faiths are, but we are not bound by a belief. We're not bound by a creed or a dogma. We're bound by a set of guiding principles, and we're bound by that intention of coming together. There was a minister, I think there is a minister, Reverend Andrew Hill, who had said very clearly that my beliefs are incorrect, my beliefs are incomplete, your beliefs are incomplete, but together we might come to something a bit fuller, into that conception of the world or life or God, however you want to call it. So really, it's not just we talk a lot about individualism within Unitarian. People come with their own preconceptions, their own sort of hack in their lives, but at the same time, it has to be this community and this sense of togetherness, and this sense of I was going to say give and take, but that's not quite right. So if you're familiar with the U.S. System with the UUs, they have 7 principles. Yeah. In the UK, we have 3 what we call freedom, reason, and we use the old term tolerance, though I tend to use respect. I feel it's a bit more accurate in its description. Sure. So it's that freedom for us to explore life, to explore truth as we understand it. That has to be bound by reason, and rationality. And then, again, it's sort of bound by tolerance. So as we're hoping and expecting to have some level of freedom in our own religious exploration, we have to allow for that for others. And in that community, we really do find that other people will have wildly different beliefs. Sure. I love, one of the reasons I love Cross Street is just because it has such a, sorry.
No worries.
No problem at all. It's not a proper interview without some technical difficulties.
Right. So I think you were mentioning something about why you really love Cross Street Chapel. So if you maybe just finish off that point.
Yeah. So Cross Street has a very wide individual. The individual congregants have their own beliefs that are quite wide in scope, from being very traditional Christian to being very interested in pagan belief or more humanist direction. But there is that tolerance, that respect for one another's view, and that understanding that actually engaging with it can only serve to enrich our lives. Only, sort of help us understand things a bit better, which is, like I say, something that's all religions have this. They have a scope and a range in their belief, but we're very explicit about it, and we're very necessary, but it's actually good for our faith to have that wide range.
Right. That's really interesting. I didn't really know that Unitarianism was so unlike other typical religions, that it, as you said, it doesn't have a specific set of dogma or a specific set of beliefs that everyone has to hold on to. So I was wondering, obviously the term Unitarianism is in contrast to the term Trinitarianism. So I wanted to hopefully segue from that into more about the historical development, how Unitarianism came to be, and how is it organized today? So you mentioned different structures of training. So how did Unitarianism originate? Where did it originate? And how is it organized today in the world?
It's a complex question, because and there's some other faiths have this, that they don't look to a single person that they'll, or we don't look to a single person that will say this is our founder or this is the person. When I talk about Unitarian history, I often describe sort of two strands, and I'm speaking particularly of British Unitarianism, though it has analogs around the world. Historically, here there's been the strand of theology, which is what you referenced, the sort of, which actually came later. There's also the strand of tolerance. And that is that understanding that it comes out of the product of the Reformation in Europe. The idea that this idea that the Bible should be open for people to explore and to interpret as they see fit. There were sort of people who explored Unitarian theology, such as Michael Servetus, in the 1500s. He's one of the people we sort of point to as a Unitarian martyr, who was burned at the stake by followers of Calvin after his published work on the errors of the Trinity. But yeah, for us nowadays, it's not as focused on that theological strand as it is on the strand of tolerance. In the UK, a lot of our churches have their origins back in 1662, when there was the Act of I'm gonna get confused on some of my terms. I think it's the Act of Uniformity, which was passed, which led to the ejection of 2,000 priests from the Church of England. One of them was Henry Newcomb. He came to found Cross Street Chapel. These were individuals with the restitution of the monarchy in 1660. There was an expectation that all the priests in the Church of England would reassent to the 39 Articles, basically proclaim what was felt to be reproclaimed that they were priests. For 2,000 of them, they felt that raised very serious theological questions. If they conducted funerals during the period of the Commonwealth, during Oliver Cromwell's rule, were those funerals invalid? Were baptisms invalid if they were saying, well, I'm a priest now, I'm recommitting to these 39 Articles? It felt like this encroachment of the political onto the spiritual life. So it wasn't necessarily a Unitarian issue that these priests had, but it was more, that theological encroachment of sort of state pressure upon spiritual life. So they were ejected from the Church of England. Newcomb, and there were subsequent laws that were passed to persecute them. They weren't allowed to preach within 5 miles of their parishes. So Newcomb had to move out to the outskirts of Manchester. He risked being jailed because he continued to come in to the city in the middle of the night to be able to tend to his congregation, which just shows sort of how passionate he was about this. In 1689, there were some rights restored, but they were actually quite explicit that Unitarian as a theological belief wasn't allowed at this point. Unitarianism as a theology wasn't legal until, I think, 1813 in the UK, although Cross Street Chapel, for instance, began preaching Unitarian theology in about the 1740s, and the UK's first avowedly Unitarian church was in 1774 in London. Like I say, the main focus isn't so much on the theology, but having been persecuted, having been a church that's had those sort of challenges, having been denied our right to preach. It's that it's very much that focus that we're a place for, we're well poised to understand the oppressions and the challenges that other faiths have, and the importance of that respect and that tolerance for differing beliefs.
And just for a point of clarification for any American listeners,
okay.
And for myself, so in the US we talk about Unitarian Universalism, and you mentioned this earlier that the two merged in the 60s. Is that something that's specific to the United States, or is there any sort of confluence with Universalism in the UK?
There's connection. There's my story, having been born in the States and coming over here, there's a connection there. Yeah. There's international organizations such as the International Council of Unitarian and Universalists, Unitarians and Universalists. But yeah, by and large, we're constrained by our own sort of country's legal structures. So it's interesting that there is still that like state, I don't want to say state encroachment, but and each, we had like, I often say to people, point out that there were, I forget how many early US presidents were Unitarian. There were a few. And yes, John Adams, for instance, John Quincy Adams, were sort of Arian or Unitarianism. Thomas Jefferson wasn't. He tended to identify as a deist, but he did say that his preferred church would be the Unitarian. Right. And at that time, it was seen possibly that if the U.S. was to adopt a church, it would possibly be the Unitarian, the Unitarian church. I often point out that a lot of that happened at a time when Unitarianism was legally illegal here in the UK. So when people ask about the differences between the two countries,
well, we have a long history of accepting the outcasts of British Christianity here in the US. That follows.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So so in terms of our structure, we have in the UK we have a national office. Based at that place, Essex Hall, where the I mentioned that first Unitarian church was on Essex Street in London. It serves in a more advisory role, though, where what sort of is described as congregational and polity, meaning each congregation has its own structure, its own constitution. Very often will be its own. Have its own charitable status, or it can be even a bit more complex than that. And other, if you go, for instance, the Hungarian and Romanian or Transylvanian Unitarians, because that's one of the other main pockets of Unitarianism in the world is in Transylvania. They have a model more with, for instance, bishops within their church. So each, the faith evolves evolves to sort of match what's needed in those areas. The UK has always had this sort of staunch congregational sort of polity, so it's been very important for congregations to feel like they can be independent of a central movement.
I mean, one of the things that I'm picking up on in sort of your discussion of the historical emergence of Unitarianism is this sort of interplay between politics and faith, which I think is a very interesting phenomenon, just generally speaking, and something that I think is sort of always a factor, right? And these are two things that we think of as being separate, but there is often sort of this mutual process of the two shaping each other, right? And so I'm wondering if, we're talking about it in terms of the history of Unitarianism, but I'm wondering if for you now, today, there's any sense that the way that you approach the faith, is it all influenced or responsive to what's happening politically in the world, or if that's something that maybe you sort of do try to keep separate?
It's very important for me, but I try to keep it in as general a sense as possible. I worry. I have other colleagues that are a bit more forthright. I don't think any of them necessarily broach into specific party politics, but they are very keen to. We are all tend to be very keen to engage in politics in what might be described as small p politics, which is about sort of structuring life and structuring, sort of civic society so that it can respond to, for instance, those in need. Now, that's not too far a stretch from what churches, historically were involved in and were engaged to do. So it's extremely important. It just makes it sort of manifested, I suppose, slightly different within church life. There's engagement within sort of other charities. For instance, I've tended to do work with Shelter, which is the noted sort of homeless and housing charity. In some of the material and engagement they do sort of tends to focus towards the political. If it gets sort of too political or too party political, that's for me the sort of the bridge where I don't want to necessarily cross. Cross Street has a very historic, active political history, which it doesn't play out as much nowadays. But back in the 1800s, we had a fair number of mayors were from Cross Street. We had a number of MPs, and one of our very long-serving ministers, the Reverend William Gaskell, was involved in various sort of political bodies. I think like the sort of public works type bodies. So it's extremely important, and it's not dismissive to be involved in faith. In fact, it's necessary that if we're involved in faith to also be engaged in some way within civic or political life.
Brilliant. So from this topic of politics, I want to turn a little bit to something which might not be entirely unrelated. I leave that open to you. It's about the figure of Jesus. So I want to ask about that both theologically, but firstly, I suppose a general question. It's a very vague question, but who, I suppose, is Jesus in your worldview? Is because sometimes you have people looking at it from a secular lens, and they look at Jesus as someone who's this political reformer, someone who's a social activist, and then obviously you have Jesus as the Messiah in traditional Christianity. So where does he fit in your personal perspective?
Within my personal perspective, it's he is about I would say a culmination of human potential. I have to be very clear that I'm talking about my perspective, because as I mentioned before, Unitarians come with their own beliefs, their own experiences. For some, Jesus is stronger than that, and for others, I don't want to say less than that, but for others, he'll be a person of significant note, but actually probably won't necessarily draw much further than that. Whereas others, it will be sort of a uniquely sort of divine figure, perhaps. I used to joke that the expansion of our belief allowed us to have Trinitarian Unitarians, and we do have. I can't think of anyone present at the church, but we've had people in the past who have had sort of sort of avowedly Trinitarian beliefs and would believe that Jesus is a unique Son of God and part of a Trinity, but they came to the church for other reasons, for that sort of respect, for that engagement with differing views. For myself, Jesus plays a very prominent role, with Unitarianism coming from and still being very much influenced by Christianity. It's extremely important for me to honor that and to explore that. And I think the words of Jesus, the words and actions of Jesus, are still very relevant, certainly to me nowadays. And if we can sort of pull those out into a contemporary context, they're very significant for other people. But I wouldn't describe that the experience that Jesus had would be outside the realm of possibility for other people. I don't see Jesus uniquely, as a unique child of God, but actually more of a manifestation that we all have the potential to know fully, our connection with the divine.
Brilliant. So I suppose I'm going to press on the theological side a little bit, just because there's something, it's a very rare opportunity to get, I suppose, a different perspective on Jesus, one that's not a Trinitarian one. So, and it's going to be a question about biblical verses. So you don't have to go into like a huge amount of detail, but the verses which are typically understood in a Trinitarian sense, so the opening of John, for example, or the famous "I am" statements in the rest of John. How do Unitarians tend to understand those kinds of verses? For example, Jesus saying, "I am the way," and those kinds of allusions to Jesus being the one and only way to God. So I suppose there's two sides of this question. There's both Jesus and Unitarianism versus Trinitarianism, and there's also the pluralism you alluded to before in the Universalism, which some Unitarians tend to hold, that there's more than one, I suppose, way to God. So yeah, please enlighten me.
Well, we look at the Bible as a human creation, perhaps divinely inspired, but very much a human creation within a context, a time, and a space. All of these Gospels were written by people sort of speaking to a community, and we try to explore that context in which things were written. We also understand the Bible as a highly metaphorical document, that it's group of documents and groups of books, because that's, of course, Bible is actually books, not just book. So it's important for us to try and see the context in which things sort of might make sense for us today, in the same sense that any metaphor that we encounter elsewhere, it's about our engagement with the text as it relates to us. We can sometimes be, I was going to say, quick to dismiss things. John, the book of John isn't as relevant within Unitarian.
I think we lost you there. Could you just go back? You were saying something about something. You said the book of John isn't as relevant.
It's not as it's not as our focus and our interest. Because you were talking about that sort of political context, or the sort of earthly human Jesus, which tends to be the one that we engage with, that we have a stronger connection to. Is the one that's more manifest within the first three Gospels. So that's for us, that's sort of our connection to Jesus is more through those Gospels rather than through John that as much.
That's really interesting, because from my very limited knowledge of the Bible, John was a later Gospel, as far as I understand.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, anyway. Go on.
If I can quickly just I was going to say tag onto that there is in the mid 1800s in the UK there was a schism within the Unitarian Church, if I can use that term. It might be a bit strong for that, but there was a lot of academic research coming out of Germany that began to open the Bible up to academic inquiry and began to ask the questions about the ordering of the Gospels, the letters, and so forth. Previously to that, a lot of Christian denominations would assess their sort of denomination through Scripture. They would say, well, God is a Baptist because of these Scriptures, or God is a Methodist because of these Scriptures. God is a Unitarian because, and I have a book in my office that is I think it's 292 verses that support Unitarianism. And so there's very much sort of pro-Unitarian views within the Bible. But what began to happen is there were Unitarians that began to get really interested in that academic research of the Bible and trying to say, well, how can that enlighten our faith? And does that then shift, our focus from being, taking the Bible as this sort of, as the basis for our faith, or sort of seeing something beyond as the basis for our faith that then is shaped, or sort of is the Bible acts as a lens of a focal point through which we understand our faith.
Yeah,
if that makes
that's
really
makes interesting. Just one last follow-up before we go on to a more festive theme. So coming from an Islamic background, I know that there are certain verses in the Quran and in the prophetic narrations which could be understood literally, and which could which could imply anthropomorphic traits of God, for example. But then what certain schools have done is, because they've, I suppose, given priority to rationality, they end up reinterpreting those verses to be metaphorical, as in this verse could be literal or it could be metaphorical, but because of rational, I suppose, argumentation that it's not possible for God to have a body, and really, really elaborate and philosophical arguments, that you have to reinterpret those things. I remember last time we spoke, you mentioned the importance of knowledge, the importance Unitarianism places on knowledge, and you talk about reason, rationality being one of those central, I suppose, guiding principles in UK Unitarianism. So I just was wondering if you could basically elaborate on that, on the role of rationality in I suppose you don't have a dogma trying to derive beliefs, personal beliefs.
Yeah, we have, and it within that historic context, one of our pioneers in the 18th century was Joseph Priestley, who discovered oxygen, and was so there's always been quite a strong science and rationality understanding. He's not a Unitarian. I think it was Wesley who had described Christian ethics as comprising of the Bible, reason, prayer, and intuition. So we sort of look at that model, that the Bible it's not sort of the end. It's not the end all be all of a faith, amazingly, and certainly within Unitarianism. So it is something we can go to. It's something we can read, and it can sort of challenge us to explore. But it's by far, it's not the only means by which one understands the workings of the divine, or one comes to some resolution over a conflict. Individual prayer might enlighten someone. Exploration of other scripture might help. And sort of looking at things through rational processes is extremely important. And like I said, if we begin with that understanding that the Bible was written by people in a context and a time, they're going to have their own presumptions, their own prejudices, their own particularly their own scientific understanding of how the world works. It's something I've never quite been able to have the time to explore, but I'm very keen to understand how people's understanding of the world in a scientific context shaped the way that they describe their faith. Because I feel that is a strong. The metaphors that we create, they all have an earthy feel. They all have a physical reality that we perceive to them. But if the metaphors that then work into the Bible actually aren't accurate in describing the sort of material world, how accurate are they in describing the spiritual world?
Well, in that vein, we have the last few minutes we have together. I was wondering, Cody, if you could speak a little bit to if there's any importance to holidays like Christmas as we're sort of approaching that time, which for many faiths is sort of like one of the 3 times that Christians will go to church.
Yes.
But,
what's the third? I know Christmas and Easter.
Yeah. I'm wondering if perhaps there's some special significance that you could illuminate for us for Christmas in the Unitarian tradition, or if there is any, or what sort of perhaps a role these sorts of holidays can play in the context of your faith.
Well, you might be able to see that there's a tree in the background. So yes. We very much celebrate, Christmas here. My church, where it's weird because we're in the city center, so we don't, and a lot of people travel, so we don't have a Christmas Day service. They usually come in via public transport, so it's very difficult for them to come in on Christmas time. Or if they live in the city, they're very often, visiting family. But we in our church, we always have an Anthems for Advent concert to mark the start of Advent. We collect toys at the start of Advent as well. We have a carol service. I forget who mentioned it, but I just remember this line, or someone said that Christmas is a time for Unitarians to throw off theological pretensions and have a good sing. So it's that importance to not always take us so seriously, and not, to sort of, that being said, the hymn book that I used for our carol service this year has a lot of revised hymns, a lot of, where the words have been altered to sort of fit Unitarian narratives and understanding. Right. But, like I said before, Jesus has a significance, within, even if it's sort of just, well, he was a very, very good person that we should emulate and follow, so we celebrate that birth. A lot of our readings might talk then about the potential for every child, the hope of a peaceful future is, resides within every child. Every child has sort of a guiding star, and deserves to be loved and honored just as Jesus was. So the theology of this is, God exclusively coming down to a person. That's not there insofar as that exclusivity. But there is, something special and something divine there for people who, profess, because we do have humanist Unitarians who, like I say, Jesus was a good person, and we should have a good sing. To come full circle from where we started today, talking about the importance of community, I can certainly imagine how a holiday like Christmas is a fantastic opportunity for communities to come together. And singing is perhaps the best way to do that. So it makes a lot of sense. Well, Reverend Cody, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
It's been absolutely lovely to talk. Rahim, do you have any last notes?
Just want to echo that. Thank you so much for joining us, and I suppose Merry Christmas to you, and Happy New Year, and to everyone else who's watching, because this will probably go up around Christmas time.
Okay. Well, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to everyone.
And hope everyone is safe as well.
Thank you, and both of you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute delight.